Well, good morning, everyone. We're glad to have you. Welcome to our Live Well event. We're really excited to be with you today and discuss our journey and process that we had with addressing chronic absenteeism in the County of San Diego. My name is Julia Breedy, and I'm an executive leadership coach with the San Diego County Office of Education. And we'd like to know a little bit about who you are. So if you can please use the chat and just quickly introduce yourself, indicate your role, and tell us what organization you are with, and just list one word that tells you that a student is engaged. And below you can see I've listed my name, my role as executive leadership coach, my organizations, SDCOE or San Diego County Office of Ed, and a word that I've used to let me know that a student is engaged in school is they're joyful. So go ahead and take a moment and begin populating the chat. I've seen a counselor. Welcome, Amelia. And her word to let us know that a student is engaged is they're curious. Who else is out there? Introduce yourselves to us. We'll give it about 10, 15 more seconds. Well, as you're listening, perhaps you can think of a student that you know. Perhaps it's a student you've worked with in your organization, your own student, a loved one. And think about what is it that they do that shows that they're engaged in school, whether it's they're joyful, they're curious, they're inquisitive, they're excited. And hold on to that as we think about our work today. Slide, please. And so today, myself and the SDCOE team who's here to join us, and I'll introduce you to them in just a second, are here to talk a little bit about improvement science and how we've used improvement science to tackle that idea or that problem of chronic absenteeism. Slide, please. Today, presenting for you, or here's actually our team at the County Office of Education who have worked on this process or this project. And you can see myself, Julia Breedy. Today, in support, we do have Ophelia in our audience, and also presenting today, we have Todd Langauger and Ann Worrell. And you'll be seeing and hearing from them a little bit later in this presentation. Slide, please. So we talked a little bit about the topic in terms of today you're here to learn about chronic absenteeism. But our wish for you is as you leave this session, you can understand and learn a little bit about the principles and tools we as a team used in relationship to improvement science and how we can use those tools to decrease the chronic absenteeism rate. And more importantly is we wish that you as an audience can reflect upon how these tools might apply to your current context in order to improve student absenteeism to improve student attendance and reduce student absenteeism. Slide, please. So before we begin, we want to talk a little bit about the problem and understanding what we mean by chronic absenteeism. So data shows that across the country, more than 8 million students are chronically absent. And if we drill down, that looks to about 1 out of 7 students. Nearly 15% of kids miss so much school because of chronic absenteeism. Slide, please. And we know that as a result of chronic absenteeism, we see other factors that are contributing to lack of success. Students who are in school have higher levels of social emotional awareness, their ability to solve problems better. They have students who are in school have higher levels of academic proficiency. Students who are in school show us that more than likely they're proficient at third grade in their reading levels. We see better grades in middle school of students who are regularly in school. We see that students who are at school often complete high school and go on in complete, and I mean complete, graduate from high school, and also go to colleges and demonstrate persistence in college. So there's that idea that chronic absenteeism relates to all of these other pieces. And so it's really important that we look at this problem and think about how we can support and be strategic in meeting the needs of these kiddos who are demonstrating that they need support from us. Slide, please. So it's important as we think about chronic absenteeism that we understand what that means as well. In the past, we perhaps maybe thought about truancy, kids who didn't come to school or were late to school. And oftentimes we might have thought about that teenager who wasn't attending high school on a regular basis. We may have had some assumptions about what absenteeism actually meant. But when we think about chronic absenteeism, we're actually talking about so much more. We're thinking about not just unexcused absences like truancy may suggest, but we're also talking about excused absences as well. So if a family calls to say that their child is sick with fever or they have the flu or whatnot, that now contributes to an absence. Suspensions as well also contribute to this idea. So it is the sum of all of these three things: excused absences, unexcused absences, and suspensions that come together and equal this idea of chronic absenteeism. Slide, please. And so what does that mean in San Diego County? In San Diego County, our data shows that 1 out of 10 students misses 18 or more days of school year. So just 2 days a month, 2 days a month, whether it be for doctor's appointments or fever or flu, could add up to 18 days, which would which would target a student for being chronically absent. That really breaks down to about 57,000 students in our county, in San Diego County. So you can see that the problem is big and vast and definitely need all of us to work on it so that we can support these students. Slide, please. So we've understood the problem a little bit in terms of what chronic absenteeism is, but we're also in this midst of a mindset shift, right? So we've clarified the problem, and like I said, we're understanding what it is, but the shift is in the sense that we're thinking about chronic absenteeism differently. In the past, we talked about it in terms of truancy. We're now thinking about it in terms of supports and strategies. And what can we do so that when we see that a student is demonstrating difficulty in school attendance and engagement, we're thinking about a system of supports and ways to understand what the problem is for the child or the family so that we can better support them. Slide, please. Not only are we as schools thinking about that, but in our legislature, our policies, our district supports, we're thinking again about what kinds of services, interventions, and things our students may need. So we're not about targeting kids and thinking, okay, they're not in school for a particular reason, but we're really trying to think about what might be those causes for the absenteeism and what can we do as a system to improve engagement, to improve attendance so that we're getting better results for kids and supporting them in a way that is positive and in a way that is productive. Slide, please. We know that in improvement, it's messy. And there's often different ways to go about it, and there's different paths that you might take, and there's different initiatives and different goals that might have happened. So we want you to take a moment and again go back to that idea of, not the idea, but to utilize the chat box and think about what types of things you currently do or that you know about that somebody might do that would work to combat chronic absenteeism and improve student attendance. So you can see that the question is on the slide now. Please take a moment and list a few things or one thing that you know about that can work to combat chronic absenteeism and improve student attendance. Thank you, Paul. Paul talks about providing access and healthcare to families. So thinking about resources. What else is out there? What other things do we know about or have thought about? And in our work with schools, we've seen schools think about incentive programs. In our work with schools, we've seen families and being visited by school counselors in their homes. We've seen that teams are holding regular attendance meetings to talk about how we can support schools. Paul's also added home visits as well. Heidi, thank you. Yeah, making connections with families and home visits. Excellent. Thank you for participating. So at this point, we're going to transition a little bit and talk about what else we've taught school teams to do or we've learned together around so that they can work to combat school attendance and improve school attendance and combat chronic absenteeism. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. So we're going to talk a little bit about the how. I'm in the county, as Julia mentioned, we have quite a chronic absenteeism concern. And so one of the things that the county office did was put together a network of schools to many heads make light work. And since many of us are wrestling with this issue, we thought if we could come together and share some ideas and use a few tools together, we might make some headway on this issue. And so part of what we did, Todd, if you want to go to the next slide, please, is to think about what is our current reality and examine that in some detail. And then apply some interventions and strategies through a series of PDSAs, which I'll talk about in a minute, in order to do this decrease in chronic absenteeism that we're aiming for. That was our aim. Slide, please. So as you can see here, we had, in San Diego County, we have 42 different school districts. We had 8 participating districts in our network to work on chronic absenteeism. Most of them were traditional schools. We had a charter school in there, a mix of TK through 5th grade schools, a K2 primary school, a 3-5 school, and some K8 schools. The smallest school in our network had 223 students, and our largest school in the network had about 1,000 students. So the range of chronic absenteeism at those schools ranged from, one of the schools had almost 20% of their students chronically absent to a low of 5%. So we had quite a range of different schools with different issues. And a lot of this work was reflected in the dashboard from last year as well. Slide, please. Improved science is a model that has quite a number of steps in there that you can choose from in order to really target your focus. And the model for improvement consists of 3 questions that you can see here on the slide. The first is the aim, like what are we trying to accomplish? What are the measures? How will we know if a change is an improvement? And then the change itself, like what changes can we make that will result in improvement? So they're very concrete questions around this model for improvement. And there are cycles. So the plan, do, study, act, the Pdsa cycle is a cycle that we used in our work. Todd, slide, please. So this graphic describes both the work and the overall timeline. When we started in August. And we started just with a webinar to invite people to the work. We talked about team expectations. We had different roles for people to do. We asked for administrators, counselors, attendance clerks, teachers, like a team from each school to get together to start doing the learning. And we also brought in some chronic absenteeism experts. Julia and Todd and I served as improvement coaches. And then, of course, as I mentioned a minute ago, the site-based practitioners. Everybody engages together in the network in a collaborative approach to learning about and addressing the problem of chronic absenteeism. So over the course of the 10 months, the school teams attended 3 face-to-face learning sessions. Those are the lighter sort of lavender color that you see. And that's where we did some learning sessions about chronic absenteeism. We learned about improvement theory itself and research-based strategies. And then each of those sessions was followed by an action period where the teams tested out their strategies and collected data at their individual school sites. Slide, please. So as a group, we decided that our collective aim in the network would be to decrease the chronic absenteeism by 5 percentage points at each school, from basically 12.7% to 7.7% if you took it as a group across all the ICAN schools. Slide, please. The first piece of that work is to really look at attendance data. And we had a lot of different ways to look at the attendance. We could see by large swaths of kiddos in terms of socioeconomic levels. We looked at grade levels. We looked at which kids had been chronically absent over time. So the first step in any sort of improvement work is to collect the data itself at each school. And we did that over quite a period of time, and that was very illuminating for a lot of people. Some of the participants began to think about, like, these are children we know, or these are families we have not yet connected. I'm sort of thinking about Heidi's point a minute ago on the chat about relationships. Slide, please. So there's a lot of reasons that sort of surface when you begin to look at chronic absenteeism. And so one of the things that we did was we sat with that data and thought through what are some of the root causes of chronic absenteeism. And you'll see there are, as you look at this list, quite a number of different reasons. And sometimes there's a combination of reasons. Sometimes it's not just one barrier, but a number of them. Sometimes it's the child or the parent has had negative experiences at school in prior years and is not willing to engage for those reasons. Sometimes the relationships are lacking in the school, and so there's a lack of engagement. Sometimes there's misconceptions about what an absence is. We found that a lot of families felt that if they'd called in to explain the absence, that the absence no longer counted. And so dispelling some of those misconceptions became part of the work. Slide, please. So another piece that was really very illuminating for many the work was to begin to do empathy interviews. and what happened with that was that the school teams took some time to meet with families either in person or over the phone or via Zoom, to talk about like what is happening in the family, like what are the stories, how can we connect with you, what are the things you're struggling with at home, what are some things that you feel like you're doing well or your child is doing well in. And through those empathy interviews, there was really some lovely connections made because there are actually conversations rather than an interrogation. The school site staff would listen to learn and listen first to understand. And there were empathy interviews done with students, even as young as kindergarten, empathy interviews done with students at all grade levels, really, and then with family members and multiple family members, empathy interviews done with teachers and attendance clerks. So this data gathering was really, really helpful to find out what are people struggling with, what are root causes. This is not this kind of data doesn't show up in CalPads. Some schools track reasons behind absences and others don't. And so the empathy interview served as a really very helpful tool to look at those root causes a little bit more closely. Slide, please. So in addition to empathy interviews, another tool is to make what's called a fishbone diagram. And once you've gathered a great amount of data, whether it's personal stories or other data, you need to consolidate and organize them into categories so you can start to make sense of them. So these were all the potential causes and reasons that we heard about students and families having a hard time coming to school regularly. So there might be family challenges, there might be academic issues, maybe it's negative student behavior. The student has been asked to leave class because they're really struggling to figure out how to be connected and have a sense of belongingness. Maybe the school's climate is lacking. People are doing a lot of different roles, and so they're not able to consistently reach out and follow through with families. Again, lack of connectedness came up quite a bit. And then there were some students that really had some particularly severe medical issues. And that was part of the reason why they weren't able to come to school. And so we were able to, I think as Paul maybe mentioned earlier in the chat, provide some access to healthcare and other resources from the school site that weren't previously known. Slide, please. And then another tool, in addition to the empathy interviews and the fishbone diagram, are what we call process maps. So sometimes it's not clear what the process is in terms of taking attendance and keeping track of attendance and following through with families. And so we asked each school to consider doing a process map of what their attendance procedures are. So you start here, say the teacher notices the child is absent. So then what happens? The teacher marks the child absent, and then what happens? Then it goes to the attendance clerk, and then what happens? And because there are a number of people involved in attendance at different levels and at varying points in the process, it's helpful to find where there might be pain points or challenges in that process, so that you can actually follow through with students that are chronically absent. So we're going to show you an example that's actually, it looks very complicated, but it is color coded. And this is one school's example of what their attendance process map looks like. So the yellow are the criteria. The green are places where teachers are involved. The orange is the attendance clerk. Counselors are in blue. Admin is in pink, and you can see that there is a what looks like very complicated process, but as you do a process map and look at your system, it becomes sort of visually illuminated, and you can see, oh, there's a stop here that we didn't anticipate. I thought that this person was taking up this role, but they actually didn't get the information, or maybe it's we need to have the administration step in maybe sooner, or a counselor step in sooner than we had originally anticipated. So the process map is a really very helpful tool as well to sort of see what is happening in your own system The empathy interviews, you're looking outside of your system and looking at what's happening in the family's situations. And the process map is a really great tool to look at, like, inwardly and internally, like what are our areas that we can be thinking more thoughtfully about making smooth as we're working toward reducing the chronic absenteeism. So the next question that we'd like to ask and invite people to think through in the chat is, if you're familiar with improvement science processes, or you've done any of this work, even just sort of individually, whether they're empathy interviews, meeting with families, or process mapping, how have you used those improvement science tools to look at chronic absenteeism at your own schools? Or if this is all very new to you, and you're thinking, oh, I might want to think about using one of these tools or beginning some of these processes, how might you use any of these improvement science tools to support your own attendance improvement efforts at your school? So just take a minute or two to think about that. And then if you would just add it to the chat, that would be terrific. That'll give us a sort of sense of what else we would like to be able to share with you this morning. And if you're unsure and not really clear exactly what you might use or think about using, if you have a question about what's been presented so far, you can certainly add that to the chat as well. I'm not seeing anything popping up in the chat right now. If you have a question that occurs to us as we're going along, then please feel free to either add it to the chat or raise a hand, and we can answer those. Julia and I will monitor the chat, and we'll hand it over to Todd now.
All right, great. Thanks, Anne. Actually, move slides here. And I just wanted to pause for a second as well, because I do know that, you know, for many of the schools that were a part of our network or part of ICAN, improvement science and the tools and principles kind of behind it was relatively a new concept for many of them. Improvement science has been kind of making its way into education circles here over the course of the last 3 to 4 years. But in terms of really taking hold at a site level, since both Anne and Julia mentioned, I mean, we had principals and counselors and attendance clerks. And so a lot of this was a paradigm shift. And these were some new ways of thinking about problems and kind of going about solving some of the problems that impact student attendance. And so, so likewise, if you are hearing this for the first time, there probably are some things that may be different or kind of new to you. And so hopefully you'll be able to think a bit more about how you might apply some of that in your own work. So, but so as Anne shared, I mean, really our learning sessions, that first learning session or the first couple months with our schools in the ICAN network really was about helping them understand their current reality. And so doing that through a variety of different kind of data collection methods. But once schools understood kind of the state of chronic absenteeism within their system, we really wanted to help organize their efforts around how do you go about making improvements and addressing really those root causes. Because again, if you remember going back to, I think, one of Julia's earlier slides, often what schools do, and schools aren't any different than many organizations, is that when we see a problem, we throw a lot of great ideas at it, or any idea that seems like a promising one, and we hope something sticks. And what improvement science does is that we try to provide a little bit more of a systematic way for schools to go out and organize their efforts and focus their efforts on some of those main drivers of the problem. And so one of the things that we created with our schools and the network and that we presented to them was this idea of like a network driver diagram here. And so really it's kind of a theory of action, if you will, that outlines what we hope to accomplish and how we're going to go about making that goal a reality. And so if you start with that green box over on the left, it really outlines our goal and what we were trying to accomplish, our aim with all of the 18 schools in ICAN. But then from research, it was clear that we really needed to focus our efforts on some of these major causes or major drivers of why students were missing, good chunks of school, right? And so things from like attendance misconceptions to lack of student engagement to negative school experiences to just barriers that maybe kept them from being able to attend school as regularly as they would like. And so knowing these things, which again, Anne alluded to, came from both the data analysis and the empathy interviews, we then wanted to help connect schools with evidence-based, research-based practices that were demonstrated to work in other school settings, but that really targeted these main primary drivers. And so over there in those tan boxes, you'll see some of the different practices and strategies, or what we called change ideas, that we had schools introduce into their system and introduce kind of like changing how they went about tackling some of these attendance issues or how their processes worked. And so specifically, some of the main things that we tested out within this first cohort of ICAN were some of these ideas. And you'll see everything from communication, how schools communicated with parents and families whose kids maybe missed more school than a typical student. So this idea of like a nudge letter where a school would send to kids or to their parents at various points during the year when they had missed a significant chunk of the school year. And what often was found is that, through no fault of their own, parents and families often underestimated. We forgot, we lose track of how many days that our kids miss school over the course of the year, or we assume that other kids are missing more, that what is average is actually higher than it is in reality. And so one of the first things that we supported our schools in testing out was this idea of changing how they communicate with parents. And so sending some nudge letters. We also, as the school year progressed, we began looking at some of these other things that come into play, like the health and well-being of kids and, hand washing, that can impact and reduce the number of kids that are out, with contagious diseases, flu and cold sort of symptoms. We also were aware that there's a lot of families that take extended vacations or extended holidays, either for 3-day, 4-day weekends or around, the winter break or spring break. And so we had schools doing some very targeted messaging to parents around those sort of trouble spot weekends or extended vacations. But then we also had them testing out a plan to get more kids on a short-term independent study contract. If the parents knew in advance that kids were going to be out, if they could get the kid on a prior short-term independent study contract, they could get the work completed so the kid wouldn't fall behind. And there wasn't that learning loss that's associated when a kid's gone for 3, 5, 6, 10 days. Incentives was also a big piece. And so all of these ideas, again, we took out of research and from other places that were shown to make these work. But then another aspect that was different in this network is that we didn't just have schools go out and try these things one time, or do it once and not really follow up with whether the strategy was working. As Anne and Julia mentioned, we really wanted folks to do it in a systematic way. And so one of the things that we taught our schools at the learning sessions was this idea of the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle, or a PDSA. And so really what the PDSA was about was taking one concrete change and focusing efforts on what do we expect to change as a result of this particular strategy or idea. So take the nudge letter, for instance. we would start with the school team, in which they would have a very clear plan, and they'd have a theory. They'd make predictions about what they thought was going to change or happen once families got these letters. They documented very clearly who was going to do what and when. And then they outlined what sort of data they were going to collect. Then in the due cycle, and this all occurred during these action periods, all 18 of our schools sent out nudge letters to targeted families during set windows of time. And they sent those letters out, and then they collected data on what happened to those letters. Did they get sent back? Did parents respond to them? Did they see changes or improvements in attendance after kids and families received these letters? And then they looked at those results, right? So often in schools and in organizations, we do a lot of great ideas and things that we think are going to work, but we don't stop and slow down enough and really study, did this make an impact on the thing that we were trying to change? Did attendance get better? And so teams would come together after those nudge letters went out. They would look at the data that was collected. They would look at the number of returned letters, parent phone calls, and the kids that got those letters, did their attendance improve? And they would wrestle with, what did we learn? What were the results? And then ultimately they needed to make a decision in that kind of act and final stage of that Pdsa cycle. Is, do we adapt this change? Like, do we need to tweak the letter slightly? Do we need to change who we're sending it to? Or is this something that really worked and demonstrated we're going to adopt as is? Or did this maybe not work in our context at all? And do we need to abandon it completely and try something else? And so these Pdsa cycles occurred really anywhere from every 2 to 4 weeks to every 6 to 8 weeks within these action periods. And our schools, we coached and supported them through these cycles so that they could really study and learn each of the nudge letters, the hand washing, the attendance messaging, the incentives, to see what difference is it making. And moreover, rather than rolling something out big and asking all teachers to do this, they tried it at a small scale, tested it a couple of times through some smaller cycles, were able to get some data back to make some changes, and said, you know what, like, we need to make a tweak, or we need to adapt it slightly, so that eventually they got it working well, so that when they pushed it out school-wide. And so really our entire network was really the engine for improvement. And so over the course of the year, in ICAN, we were really pleased and excited to see that, we tracked monthly chronic absenteeism rates across all 18 of our schools. And so you see here on this chart that the gray line represents all 18 of our schools and their monthly chronic absenteeism rate. So from the 2018-19 school year, you see that gray line. The blue line represents the year in which they were with us participating in ICAN. And so 2019-20, you'll see throughout the entire portion of their involvement in ICAN, their monthly chronic absenteeism rate, or the number of kids that were chronically absent, was below the 2018-19 levels for the entire year. And more specifically, you'll see called out there in those annotations where they sent the nudge letters 3 different times during the year, and where the schools did some testing around the hand washing best practices, the messaging, and the attendance incentives. And you see again that we saw a decrease in the number of kids, the percentage of kids that were chronically absent. And so for us, it was not quite that 5% goal that we were targeting, but all the way up through March 1st, we had a decrease of about 3.4 percentage points, or actually 377 students less than the prior year were chronically absent. And so our network average was down at about 10.3% before obviously COVID hit. And so, and even more excitingly is, I think when you drill down to look at this same data at the school level, you'll see that 16 out of 17 schools decreased their chronic absenteeism rates as compared to the prior years. And so some schools had a smaller decrease or level of improvement, whereas you'll see some schools here where that blue line is significantly below the gray line of 2018-19. And so for us, again, this was an example of when school teams set very clear targets, when they strategically and systematically test out specific evidence-based practices and ideas, and they collect the data in a way, this tells folks whether or not what they're doing is making an impact or a difference. And so we saw that across the network, but then also more excitingly, school teams saw this at their local level. And from that, we were also able to ascertain that, some of the schools that some of the biggest gains had some of these other conditions in place where they had very strong principal or vice principal leadership. Their teams met very regularly, and had very standardized meeting agendas. And so there was a lot of things that I think went into play here with this data, but I know that we were really excited at the results that we were able to achieve in about the 8 months that we had with folks before COVID. And so, as everyone is aware, by the time we got to March, we were turning the corner towards the end of the year, and we had one more learning session. We had an action period, all of that built for this cohort, and then COVID hit, and our schools went into shutdown mode and closure across the county. Everyone was in distance learning. And really, the state of kind of student attendance across the county and across the country was really thrown into disarray. And so our cohort kind of came to a kind of crashing halt, unfortunately, in the spring. But, we maintained communication and touch with folks over the summer. And as a county team, we really began to do some long-term strategizing and planning around, well, what do we do next in terms of supporting our schools around student attendance and chronic absenteeism? Because I think what became even more important and obvious was that in a state of a pandemic and kids in distance learning or in hybrid or some sort of mixture, schools, districts, teachers were being asked to do an incredible amount to monitor whether or not kids were attending school physically there or virtually there, were they engaged? And, we recognized that there was a huge need for us to continue offering some supports. And so before I move on to kind of what we did with that, I do want to throw one more kind of question out to the group in terms of the chat. And I know that there's some other questions popping up in the chat, so maybe we pause to get some of those as well. But just our question to you all is, how has COVID-19 impacted your attendance improvement efforts, whether you're at a school or whether you're at another community organization or a community partner? What has the pandemic done to your attendance improvement efforts? And if you could share a couple of those comments or things in the chat, I'll pause here for just a minute or two to kind of see what COVID has done to kind of your reality around these attendance improvement efforts.
We have Crystal sharing that they've not been able to do home visits, which has been very difficult and decreased ability to connect and reach out with families. Thanks, Crystal.
Other ways that COVID has impacted some of the things that your organization or school does around attendance.
Heidi's continued to grow that idea or air that concern around home visits. She says that they're just hard, and it seems that families are less open to express their needs.
Very true. Yes, that lack of kind of physical interaction that we so typically have with our families and with students, I think does make it a lot more challenging to really understand the circumstances and the needs that folks are struggling through right about now. And there are a lot of needs and difficult circumstances out there in our families. So I see some more comments around difficulty conducting home visits, in-person meetings, connecting with parents. And
There's
then,
also
yes,
that, excuse me, Todd, there's also that issue of while organizations are holding going out on home visits, that sometimes families have moved, and so families perhaps they're being lost in the system and they're not able to follow up even though the home visit practice is in place.
exactly. And I also just, I see a comment here from Shauna around, a big kind of mindset shift, right? Is that, in this current environment, right? Like taking attendance used to be relatively straightforward, right? Pretty black and white. Was a student present or absent? To now, we have these concepts and ideas around attendance and participation and engagement. And there's a lot more to think about and things to take into consideration, whether you're in distance learning and hybrid or in person. I see some comments about, parent burnout, parents having a lot on their plates, right? If they are having to work from home, or if they're an essential worker having to go to work, how can they support their students at home with school if they're not physically present, or if they're having to engage in work themselves from home? So I see some housing issues. Right, right. And I know that, yes, we have heard that repeatedly from some schools, that there is a growing number of families and students that they've lost touch with, for sure in the springtime and the summer, and continued here into the fall. And so, and I also see that comment around engagement, right? There's a difference in online engagement and the ability to establish relationships with new students and, a new teacher. And it's harder to have that sense of connectedness and belonging, for sure. And so, for really, all those reasons that you all mentioned in the chat and many more, our team at the county office over the summer, we really kind of began pivoting from, our Improving Chronic Absenteeism network, where we were poised to recruit and launch a second cohort of schools, kind of continuing that phase of the work. And we really kind of pivoted and adapted our approach to a little bit more of an open, kind of informal network for all districts and schools. And so back in September, we launched the SPARK network, which stands for Strengthening Participation, Attendance, and Re-engagement During COVID. And so, our vision and our beliefs behind this is that really now more than ever, students need to be at school. Students need to show up for school in whatever sense that means, whether it's in the virtual sense, whether it's in the physical sense. And schools, teachers, administrators, districts, there's even more of a burden and an expectation upon folks to engage families and to make sure that they are showing up in these various different learning modalities. And so we knew that schools in our districts were going to need support with this, that this is really uncharted territory for all of us, and that we couldn't continue just letting folks try to figure this out on their own. And we felt that from our success with ICAN, that we could take some of those lessons learned, some of those sort of concrete practices that have been shown to work, and adapt them to make them successful in a distance learning environment, in a hybrid environment, and really just more importantly, provide a network or collaborative space for school teams to come together and problem solve, collectively share, collectively learn, and utilize some of these same tools of improvement science, but in a slightly different capacity. And so we've been meeting every month since September. We meet once a month for about 90 minutes. And really our work has been kind of focused on this overarching theory of action, is that if we want to reduce the number of students that are experiencing lost learning time due to COVID, which really that is the ultimate impact of absenteeism, right? Is that lost learning time, is that we then need to increase student attendance, participation, and re-engagement through the reduction and elimination of attendance barriers. And I think, as we all know, the barriers have really only multiplied now that we are in a distance learning, hybrid sort of learning environment, is that there are many more reasons why kids have challenges showing up and participating in school, whether it's technology, whether it's working parents, whether it's sick or health issues. It's just, fear of the virus, right? Another area that we've been trying to focus on is just that effective communication strategies and our systems for communication. Is that when we're not physically with people in person, we need to be all the more effective and deliberate and intentional with our communication and how we're talking to parents and how we're communicating with students and following up with them on a real-time sort of basis. The technology access and support, that's been huge. And I think, fortunately, there's a lot of partners out there in San Diego County that have been very supportive of districts and schools, but I know that we still have families that struggle with consistent and reliable internet access, access to devices, and for sure some of our rural parts of San Diego County, they have families that don't have those same connection opportunities and access to devices. So, and then really just those final two pieces is like, how do we help schools and school teams really think about building strong relationships and positive learning experiences when kids may be entirely, getting to know their their teacher and their classmates via a screen, via Zoom, and in an online environment like Google Classroom. It's a different sort of instructional model, and it's a different way for us to interact and build those relationships. And so Spark has really been about school teams sharing what they're doing and what's working, getting them connecting with each other in kind of job-alike roles, and being able to talk attendance clerk to attendance clerk, principal to principal, counselor to counselor, and doing some kind of collective problem solving. And then we at the county have been trying to pull in again, examples of evidence-based research and practices that we know to be effective and working. And so that has been our focus here. And as I said, we've had a really strong turnout here for the past 3 months. We actually have a Spark Network meeting here later today that any one of you would be welcome to join. But yeah, we've been thrilled to see such a high interest from schools and school leaders and district leaders out there, because we know that these are challenging times. And so there's a link here that if you wanted to register, it's still not too late to join us here today. It's from 1 to 2:30. It's always the first Thursday, I believe, of the month. And you see we have 7 more meeting dates for the remainder of this year. And we encourage folks to come as a team because we do really believe that this work can't reside on the backs of just one individual, but really needs to be a district or a school team that leads and kind of guides this. So I know we only have about 8 minutes left.
Yes. Yep.
And so I want to for sure give us some time to have questions, because I know we are going to be cut off right at 11 o'clock.
And so there was a couple of questions that came up in the chat, and was one being, can we still join ICAN? Yes, but now it's called Spark as we've pivoted in this new situation. Additionally, there were some questions around empathy interviews and just the inquiry around, they seem labor intensive and time take a lot of time. And so there was some curiosity around that. And so if I might respond that the groups that did conduct the empathy interviews, we're learning to do them. And so sometimes they made decisions about the groups that they were reaching out to, the families they were reaching out to. So as they were learning to improve their processes and improving their capacity in supporting kiddos, in order to make it less overwhelming, knowing that the problem was really big, they were selecting where might they get the biggest bang for their buck in just learning how to do the empathy interview process while finding out information as well. So I hope that helps answer the question a little bit. Anne, did you see any other questions you wanted to lift
Yeah,
from the chat?
just the same sort of idea, like it seems labor intensive, but really every school had between 3 and 5 people on their team, and they met maybe once every 2 weeks for about 20 minutes, half an hour. And they made decisions about what data they had collected, and then decided on next steps. And then everybody sort of divided and conquered and went back out to do maybe empathy interviews, or collecting more attendance data from teachers or whatever it was, and then they'd come back as a group. So it does seem a little overwhelming at the beginning, but once the team started meeting regularly, it became quite fluid. There are a question from Michael about, is there anybody looking at why the same students are not finding virtual learning attractive and exciting for students? And there is some research around that this group has not touched on, but it's related to relevancy in terms of the curriculum for kids. So looking into that piece of it. But we invite you guys to come join us. Either this meeting or the next one. Todd, if you want to put back on the screen the dates, that would be great. And then we can also send out to this group a list of the schools that were involved. Someone else had asked if they could know who the schools were that had done this work.
And there was a quick slide on slide 15. I believe you have access to our slide deck, and there's the list of all the schools who participated in the ICAN network as well.
And we have, on our final slide, we have our contact information. So if you have specific questions or you want more specific documents, feel free to reach out to us directly.
So I think we'll just pause to see if you have any other questions.
I'm seeing one a comment here from, or a question kind of from Jonathan, around how we've been kind of trying to measure the success of Spark. And Jonathan, I would say yes, you hit the nail right on the head, in that with ICAN we had a very close, intimate kind of working relationship with the 18 schools where they were sharing data with us. We had very clear metrics that we were monitoring. And with Spark, it has definitely shifted to more of a kind of open network. And we do have, we've had over 80 participants at some meetings with, I think, 20 plus districts, 30, 40 some schools. And so we have not been able to measure that same sort of level of success down to like changes in attendance rates. But I know that we are trying to collect some data around kind of the capacity building efforts of this network, and just the degree to which that they feel more empowered to work on attendance improvement in this current kind of environment. Because yes, it is definitely a lot more challenging and much more of kind of a crisis mode.
We did earlier in the chat also place a link to the empathy interview guide that we used when leading the ICAN network that you can access. And we also placed in the chat as well a template of the nudge letter that we used across the network schools.
And some talking points related to that nudge letter. So we hope this has been useful for everyone. And as Todd mentioned, we're definitely available for all of you at any point if you're interested in doing some of this work at your own schools.
Here's just the slide with our contact information. So again, please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly, and know that we would love to see some folks, familiar faces here at our December Spark Network meeting here this afternoon at 1 o'clock. So